Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. To form a clear idea of the forces at work in any country doesn't just require familiarity with the politicians of the epoch or its defining events, be they economic crashes, terrorist attacks, or, to choose a completely random example, referendums. It also requires the ability to hear the conversations being had around dinner tables and water coolers, in canteens and pubs, behind the closed doors of newspaper offices, academic seminars, and shady private clubs, and on TV and, more recently, social media platforms. It's hard to think of a novelist more adept at taking the pulse of the United Kingdom than Jonathan Coe. Over a career spanning a dozen novels so far, he has time and again demonstrated an eye for both the absurdity and the crushing self-regard of the British. Their, or I should say our, nostalgic bent, our profound sense of shame, the gentleness of which we're capable, but also the viciousness, how we love to laugh at ourselves, but how we hate the idea of others laughing at us. Jonathan Coe's latest novel, Middle England, contains all these elements and more. Beginning in April 2010 and encompassing a period that saw the fall of the new Labour government and the arrival of the Conservative Lib Dem coalition, the effects of the financial crisis and the austerity beginning to bite, riots in London, the Olympic Games, the rise of UKIP and the slide towards Brexit, as well as its aftermath, or at least as much of the aftermath as we can currently know, Middle England reunites readers with characters first met in 2001's The Rotters Club, then in 2004's The Closed Circle. Benjamin and Lewis Trotter, Philip Chase, Doug Anderton, as well as a new generation, Lewis's daughter Sophie, Doug's daughter Coriander, their friends and partners. Packed with all the insight, charm and humour with which Jonathan Coe made his name, and somehow managing to be both elegiac and optimistic, Middle England is the perfect British state-of-the-nation novel for a period when, let's face it, the nation of Great Britain is in quite a state. As Jonathan Coe himself writes, it was tempting to think, at times like this, that some bizarre hysteria had gripped the British people. Jonathan Coe was born in Birmingham. His other novels include What a Carve-Up, The House of Sleep, The Rain Before It Falls, and Number 11. He's won many literary prizes at home and abroad, and his biography of the writer B.S. Johnson, Like a Fiery Elephant, won the Samuel Johnson Prize. In 2017, he published a novella for children, The Broken Mirror. Writing in the Irish Times, John Boyne observed that millions of words have been and will be written on Brexit, but few will get to the heart of why it's happening as incisively as Middle England. And Alex Preston, reviewing Middle England for The Observer, said, "While we want everything we read at the moment to speak with the voice of our own particular echo chamber, Coe, a writer of uncommon decency, reminds us that the way out of this mess is through moderation, through compromise, through that age-old English ability to laugh at ourselves." Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Coe to Shakespeare and Company.
Thank you. You know, I haven't been reading my reviews, so it's the first time I've heard those quotations.
Well, I had a lot to choose from anyway.
Right. Okay.
I guess where we probably should begin is with the origins of this book. Now, for readers who are familiar with the Rotters Club and the Closed Circle, I guess with the Closed Circle, the clue was in the name. I mean, these. When you read them, and I suspect when you wrote them, we had a sense that this was a unit, that this was sort of one story, one narrative arc being told. And yet here, what are we, 14 years after the Closed Circle?
Yeah.
You decide to revisit these characters. So I suppose my first question is, why these characters and why now?
Yeah, Gallimard, my French publisher, has done a very nice one-volume edition of The Rotters Club and the Closed Circle, for which I wrote a special introduction. And I stated very clearly in that introduction that they were two books. They were always going to be just two books. It was called The Closed Circle because it was the closing of the story, and there would be no more episodes in the series whatsoever. So we now have to recall all those copies, and I have to rewrite the introduction because 2.5 years ago I started finding myself thinking about these characters again, and there were two impulses tugging against each other inside my head, really. One was kind of quite a nostalgic impulse to revisit these characters who I'd enjoyed writing about very much in the earlier two books, particularly The Rotters Club. And I'd just seen a stage adaptation of The Rotters Club in Birmingham, and that had kind of made the book fresh to me again after a long kind of absence from it, and reawakened my curiosity to know and to speculate what these characters might be doing in middle age. So there was that feeling. And then, around the referendum and its aftermath, the country was going crazy, and the government was in turmoil, and the British people had delivered this very narrow verdict, which had taken everybody, well, most people by surprise. And I thought, well, that's what I should really be writing about in a way. I mean, that's a great subject for someone like me who likes to write about politics and so on. And for a while, those two things were at war in my head, and then I just had one of those kind of eureka moments when I thought, well, actually, these are the same novel, surely, and the thing to do is to get Benjamin and Lois and Doug and Philip back and put them in 2016 and see how they react. And that was a moment of great relief, because I had no idea how to write a novel about Brexit. How do you write a novel about Brexit? It's not a subject for a novel. It's just a political idea. And knowing that I could kind of fall back on these characters like a sort of safety cushion gave me the confidence to take it on.
One thing that's very striking, rereading The Rotters Club and The Closed Circle in the context of Middle England being out, is how much it does seem to fit into the same narrative arc. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, the Rotters Club takes place in the last few years of the 1970s. So just at the moment that Margaret Thatcher is ascending and taking power, the Closed Circle takes place in the early years of the Blair premiership. And what we're living through now seems to be, in many ways, the consequence of both of these two epochs.
Yeah.
And so it's so fascinating to think that something which seemed closed could suddenly open again, because it has an impact on our view of history, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose that's where I was kidding myself, really, in writing The Closed Circle the way that I did, and calling it what I did, because history never ends. And it repeats itself in endless loops and variations. And Brexit didn't come from nowhere. It's you can see it as the kind of outward expression of seething discontents and irritations on the part of the public, which have been brewing for years, all through the Thatcher and Blair years, and which you now see coming out in slightly different form in France, I think. It's the undercurrents behind these things are not different. It's just that we expressed it through our referendum, and the French are expressing it by rioting. So maybe that's the two different national characters at work there. But I don't like rereading my books. I find it impossible to reread them, in fact. So I didn't reread The Rotters Club and The Closed Circle. I skimmed through them to make sure that I got my dates right and the relationships between the characters right, because it's a very large and complicated cast of characters, and the chronology had to fit and that kind of thing. So I looked through them again for that. But I didn't actually do a reread. And I wrote Middle England, much to the relief of my publisher, in such a way that you don't have to have read Rotters Club or The Closed Circle to get it, although it would probably help.
And although, interestingly, in that, I guess in defence of the title, The Closed Circle, that book does actually end with a sense of a kind of impending storm, actually. The sort of like that history is mounting towards something, we don't know what. And if I hadn't known that it had been published in 2004, it might have almost felt sort of too easy an ending. If you'd written it in 2018 and said, but we don't know what's coming next. Okay, you kind of do.
And even more so, actually, because there's a deleted chapter from The Closed Circle, which my UK editor asked me to take out of the book, because the chapters in The Closed Circle are numbered in reverse. And it ends with chapter 1, but it actually ended with chapter 0, which was a chapter about the British Leyland factory at Longbridge, the car factory, which is at the centre of all three novels in some ways. And, at the time, the people of Birmingham thought that factory had been saved, and that Birmingham, and by extension Britain, still had a kind of industrial future. But that turned out to be an illusion. And the factory actually closed down about a year after I published the book, and there was a final chapter 0 which gestured towards that. So it made the book even more open-ended, actually, but it wasn't published that way. Maybe I should restore it, but I think it's on a very old computer somewhere.
This book, obviously, as I said in the introduction, it takes place between April 2010 and September of this year.
Yeah.
And that's quite a remarkable feat, writing about such contemporary politics. I mean, obviously, the Rotters Club was written with a lot of hindsight, a lot of sort of a sense of what might come. The Closed Circle, a few years after the events it describes, but not a great deal. But this book seems like it must have almost been written live. And I just wonder what sort of challenges that presents to, obviously particularly the Brexit chapters.
Yeah.
Like what sort of challenges that presents to a novelist dealing with politics and events which are so open-ended.
Well, it was very exhilarating apart from anything else. I mean, it was exciting to write chapters based on real events which had only happened a couple of months or a few weeks ago in some cases. So I think that's one of the things that gives the book its energy. I mean, I'm quite a cautious person by temperament, so it's always been a kind of a belief of mine that yes, if you're going to write about politics, if you're going to write about history, then you need some hindsight. But I just decided to throw that to the winds with this book, really, and hope that I got it right. And if it turns out that I got it wrong, then that will be maybe interesting in a different way, and people can talk about why I got it wrong or how I got it wrong, and whether that makes the book read differently in a few years' time than it does now.
Was it also written with a thought to having an impact or an effect, or is that a dangerous impulse for a novelist to have?
I don't think it's a dangerous impulse, but it's you're kidding yourself, I think, if you think that's going to happen. I mean, very, very, very occasionally, books will have a real political impact. But no, I wrote it, I think, because I wanted to put on record, to my satisfaction, not just what happened between 2010 2018, but how it felt to live through that. So it's really an attempt to capture the emotional texture of the last 10 years.
And specifically,
I don't expect anybody will pick it up and think, "Ooh, I wanted to leave the European Union, but now I don't." It doesn't. Literature doesn't, unfortunately, work that way very often.
And particularly the choice of 2010, April 2010, as the start date, because so much of what goes on in the novel is impacted by what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. And you choose to not to pick that specifically, but to pick it up the moment just before Gordon Brown when Gordon Brown is on the campaign trail, essentially, is when the novel starts.
It was a slightly arbitrary choice. I mean, I wanted to write about the 2011 riots in London, so I knew that I had to start the book some way before that. The original plan was to start with Benjamin's birthday party, Benjamin's 50th birthday, which would have fallen in 2010, but for some reason, which I forget, I jettisoned that idea and started on a much gloomier note with his mother's funeral. But it did seem, once I'd chosen it did seem the right moment. The aftershock of the financial crisis was still very strong. Also, a thing which I mentioned in the first chapter of the book, but not so many people talk about these days, which was the 2009 MPs' expenses scandal, which in some ways can be seen as quite a small scandal. And it turned out that a lot of MPs from all parties in the British Parliament had been fiddling their expenses, basically, and claiming second mortgages that they shouldn't have been, and billing the taxpayer for repairs to their house and that sort of thing. The sums involved were quite small, really, in the scheme of things. But actually, that story was in the Telegraph, so it was cutting right through to Middle England, and it ran for a long time. It ran for a number of months, I think, and it damaged a lot of people's trust in politicians, and I think that is a major factor, actually, in what's happening not just in the UK but all over the place at the moment. That a basic kind of pact of trust between the people and the political class has kind of broken down, And I think that had a lot to do with the anger which motivated people to vote for Brexit.
Mm-hmm. You used the term Middle England, which of course you chose as the title for your novel. And indeed there's a moment in The Closed Circle where one of the characters is writing a short story and talks about being in the countryside and in a dark place and a sinister place. Middle England. Now, to an English person, to a British person, the term Middle England is, I find, very evocative. I mean, it gives me a sense immediately of a certain
it's a mindset as much as anything else.
Indeed.
Yes.
And yet quite hard to pin down. And I suspect for an international audience, perhaps it doesn't have the same resonance that it does to a British person. I mean, I wonder how, for example, in the French translation, how the title Middle England will be rendered. But would you be able to give us a sense of what you understand by Middle England?
Well, the book's been published in Italian translation already, and their very creative solution to that problem was to call it Middle England.
Okay.
In English. So I guess they just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, "Well, whatever." And the Dutch translation, which comes out in a couple of months, is called Little England, Kleiner England, which is not quite the same. I mean, I'm kind of fascinated by the phrase because I come from the geographical centre of England. I come from Birmingham, and I grew up in the Midlands, and it's a very evocative phrase for me, not just because of the kind of landscape and topography it gestures towards, which is described in the early pages of the book as being a kind of diffident, unspectacular kind of landscape, muted greens and greys, which suit the temperament of Benjamin Trotter, the main character. But yes, it's a set of values which to me have to do with a certain kind of insularity, a kind of patriotism verging on nationalism, a set of attitudes kind of summed up by the Daily Mail newspaper, really, although the Daily Mail has a new editor now and its politics have changed slightly. So those kind of things. And also, as I mention quite often in the book, it's the part where I'm writing about here, which is the kind of rural outskirts of Birmingham, is also the part of the country that J.R.R. Tolkien came from, and which he described in fantasy form when he created the Shire and populated it with hobbits. And I loved Tolkien when I was a kid. Still do love Tolkien, actually. And there was something, even though these novels were set in Middle Earth, there was something extremely familiar about it to me, and I didn't bother to find out where he came from or anything like that. But eventually I found that he went to the same school as me. He grew up down the road from me, and Mirkwood and Lothlorien and all these wonderful forests and woods that he described were based on the woods that I walked in every weekend with my parents and this kind of thing. So there's a great sense of Middle Englishness in Tolkien's Middle Earth as well, I think.
And I guess in a way it also taps into a sort of an English sense of mythology as well. I mean, that's what sort of Tolkien seemed to be
trying to create, yeah.
And so much of I think the discussion in Britain at the moment, and also in the book, is this sense of how do we define, what does it mean to be English? Well, there seems to be a kind of an ongoing tussle. Perhaps there will always be a case in any country that tries to pin down a sense of identity about what it actually represents. But one thing that we meet, particularly at the beginning of the book, is these sort of received ideas as the English or the British. And again, this is a distinction which some people make very clearly, others less so. But of a certain eccentricity, but also a sense of tolerance. And indeed, you put the words into the mouth of a French novelist in the book who says the French are an intolerant, judgmental people, not like the British, I think.
Yes.
And it has interested me over the last few years to see how the British and the English have come to have to sort of to face up to these perhaps not being quite as as inherently tolerant as we took it for granted we were.
I think when we're talking about the Brexit vote, we have to be very careful and to talk specifically about England. And in fact, Anthony Barnett, in his book *The Lure of Greatness*, which I think is one of the best, one of the most quickly published analyses of the Brexit vote, actually divides the United Kingdom up into 5 territories: Northern Ireland, which voted to remain; Scotland, which voted to remain; London, which voted to remain; and then Wales, which voted narrowly to leave; and England without London is what he calls it, which voted overwhelmingly to leave. And one of the main geographical dichotomies that the book plays with is between London, the capital city, and the rest of the country. And in the character of Sophie, who is Benjamin's niece, and who carries the bulk of the story, really, she's very torn because she's spent a lot of time in London. She's come to love it for its cosmopolitanism and its multiculturalism. And then she marries a guy from Birmingham and ends up commuting between the two cities every week, and kind of experiencing this dichotomy for herself in real terms. But yes, there is a very complacent discussion at the beginning of the book between an English novelist and a French novelist, who are both kind of mutually congratulating each other on their literary achievements and their wonderful senses of national identity. And the English novelist Lionel Hampshire comes out with this phrase that, yes, the only thing immoderate about the English is our love of moderation. And he's very pleased with himself when he says this. But really, it's one of those opinions you plop in at the beginning of the book specifically with the idea of showing that it's not actually true.
Yeah. And indeed, one of Sophie's friends, Sohan, who's kind of almost like the kind of canary in the coal mine for this kind of thing. After this discussion we're just talking about, he says, I've written it down here, every day you come face to face with people who are not tolerant at all. They want to use one of those forbidden words on you. So as well as hating you, they also hate them, the faceless people who are sitting in judgment over them somewhere, legislating in what they can and can't say. And that sort of sense of, like I say, there's not only a sense of, the other who you don't like, but there's also the powers that be that are sort of suppressing your desire to express this dislike.
Well, I talked about the dichotomy between London and the rest of England, and I feel this myself, really, and experience it myself, because I live in London and have done for 32 years. So I finally started to describe myself as a Londoner and think of myself as a Londoner. And actually, the referendum was one of the key factors that pushed me into doing that. But I go to the Midlands a lot because most of my family are still there. And yes, you really do hear things talked about in a different way. And you hear, when you leave London, you hear people saying things which would not necessarily be said so unguardedly in metropolitan circles. And certainly over the last 10 years, I've regularly heard a lot of people complaining about political correctness and how you're not allowed to say what you think these days. What they mean is not that they're not allowed to say it, but you might be called up on it if you say it. But it becomes, for some people, a kind of freedom of speech issue. And there's actually, in the very centre of the book, and I mean the very centre because it's chapter 23 out of 45, there's a speech by Sophie's mother-in-law, Helena, who is the kind of embodiment of Middle England, really. So if you want to see what I mean by the phrase, then there it is. And she's talking to a Chinese guy, a Chinese businessman who was over to do some business in the Midlands with a dairy farmer. And, she actually says to him, again, which I've heard said, you think you live in a totalitarian regime, but actually we're under a tyranny as well, and it's called political correctness. And she means it. She feels it as a kind of a very strong inhibiting force on her freedom of speech. And, that was a resentment which in a strange kind of inexplicable way is also, I think, kind of went underground and then erupted in this weird vote and emerged as a form of hostility to the European Union. I've never quite understood what the European Union has to do with political correctness, but in lots of people's minds, the two are linked.
There's also a strange kind of cognitive dissonance at work as well, in that if you look at the British media, a lot of it over the last sort of 20, 30 years has become increasingly right-wing, increasingly virulent, in fact. And so a lot of the things that apparently you're not allowed to say are said openly and on a daily basis and read by millions.
Yes, absolutely.
And there just seems to be that odd contradiction there.
Yeah.
But what the root of it is difficult to tell. But let's talk a little bit about the sort of the kind of the politics in that case behind the vote. Like, there's one moment, one of the characters, Charlie, says, "The way I see it, everything changed in Britain in May 1979. 40 years on, we're still dealing with that." And that did seem to sum up a lot of the I guess regret felt by a lot of different characters in the novel, and that sense of decline. On one side, for example, there's Benjamin's father, who there's a very poignant moment where they visit the Longbridge, where the Longbridge factory used to be. And he says, "We don't make things here anymore. How can that be?" And yet
it's now the largest Marks and Spencers in Europe. So I don't have to look far for my metaphors. They're handed to me on a plate.
And yet at the same time, there's also like Benjamin himself, who is in doesn't share his father's sort of political views, and yet he's thinking about the Morecambe and Wise comedy special. I think it's from 1977.
Yeah, where 27 million people watch the same TV show and this kind of thing. Yeah.
And regretting the sort of saying that the country was much more united back then, was much more. There was much more cohesive.
Yeah,
in a sense. So it's not just coming from the kind of the obvious side of the political spectrum. It seems more generalised.
I mean, I think nostalgia of every sort has played a really important role in politics and political discourse in the last decade or so. And whether it's some of the Brexit voters looking back to the so-called glory days of the Second World War, when Britain apparently stood alone against Europe and this kind of thing, or whether it's Benjamin looking back to what he sees as actually a very idealised, cohesive, welfare state-driven Britain of the 1970s. And there is nostalgia on all sides, and the book is a warning against it, really. And finally, in the final chapter of the book, Benjamin starts to realise that the England he now misses and has left, because it ends with him leaving the country, was probably a product of his imagination anyway, or his false memories of a very happy childhood. And Anika, the 20-year-old Asian stepdaughter of one of the characters, when she hears him waxing nostalgic like this, starts saying, "Well, that's great for you, but it wouldn't have been so good to be a Pakistani female teenager back in the 1970s. Nostalgia works in lots of different ways."
Do you think it's something also which is sort of increasingly difficult to resist, particularly with perhaps an aging population, for example? That sort of is it a sort of a natural tendency to, as our bodies decay, to assume society is decaying at the same rate and to wish for?
Oh, I mean, nostalgia is incredibly seductive, and I'm really prey to it myself. So it's, and my novels are full of nostalgia, are full of people aching for the past. But just in the last few years, I've come to the conclusion that it's got us all into a really bad place, and what we should be doing is thinking about the present and indeed the future.
But it seems like it takes a sort of a concerted effort.
Yeah, it does.
To do that.
It does. Yeah.
Let's. I think we could, in a moment, we'd like to talk a little bit about the political class themselves. But I think that could be a good moment to hear a reading from the book, because the one we were talking about does touch on that.
I was looking for a way of trying to get not just the personal story of the characters and their families and their relationships and so on into the novel, but I wanted to find some way of writing in a kind of satirical way about how the politicians what they were talking about, and what life was like for the political class in the last 10 years. So I created this character called Nigel Ives, and he's a very junior, very, very, very junior press spokesman for David Cameron and the Conservative government generally. And even though he's ridiculous, I really like Nigel. He's one of my favourite characters in the book. He's always contradicting himself. He's always putting a good spin on things. And he thinks that everything is going swimmingly, actually, and that Britain is completely on the right track until the final time we see him. And just as the book itself could be seen as a portrait of a country having a nervous breakdown, this chapter is the portrait of a man having a nervous breakdown. He regularly meets up with a political journalist called Doug at the cafe at the tube station at Temple Tube on the District line. And there are 5 of these dialogues, most of which predate the Brexit referendum, and this is the 5th one, which takes place in October 2017, so about 16 months after Britain has voted to leave, and things are not quite as calm and smooth in Conservative Central Office as they have been at their previous meetings. Doug felt about the cafe at Temple Tube Station very much as Benjamin and Lois felt about the view from Beacon Hill. There was something profoundly reassuring about it, about the way that it hardly seemed to change, as the same chains of coffee shops continued to take over the capital, and indeed the whole country. Here was a place that still served bacon rolls, salt beef sandwiches and frothy cappuccinos, with not a decaf soya latte in sight. It seemed to preserve a corner of Britain that was left over from the 1970s or even earlier, and this gave it a distinctive charm, as even Doug wouldn't deny. "Good morning, Douglas." The greeting was stale and world-weary. Doug looked up from his notebook and saw Nigel taking the seat opposite him. The youthful rosiness was gone from his face. He was sporting several days' worth of stubble. His cheeks were pale and sunken, his tie was badly and hastily knotted, his hair did not look like it had seen a comb for weeks. He sipped gratefully on the coffee Doug had already ordered for him. "Nigel, good to see you again," Doug said, "at long last." "Yeah, it has been a while, hasn't it? When did we last do this?" "I think it was just a month or 2 before the referendum." Ah, yes. When he heard those 3 words, "before the referendum," Nigel's eyes took on a wistful, almost spiritual glimmer, and he stared past Doug's shoulder as if into the distant past, towards a better, pre-lapsarian time, a time of carefree innocence and simple, childlike joy. 16 months, more or less. "Really," said Nigel, "is it only 16 months? Somehow it seems longer, much, much longer." He shook his head sadly. "So," said Doug, "to what do I owe this rare privilege?" "Well, I'll be honest with you, Douglas. Whatever else you may think of me, I've always tried to be honest. Keep this strictly to yourself, but I'm probably going to be leaving this job. I thought we should have one more chat before I go." "Really? This means promotion, I hope." "I'm afraid not. I think it's time for me to leave the world of politics. Pastures new." "Well," said Doug, "you've had a good run." "I suppose so," said Nigel, not sounding especially convinced. "But before I do that, I wanted to set the record straight." "Go on," said Doug. "OK, since the referendum," said Nigel, "you've said several things about David Cameron, which in my personal opinion, all things considered, and not to put too fine a point on it, seem rather unfair." "Surely not." "Calling him the worst British Prime Minister of my lifetime, for instance." "Did I say that?" "Saying he was a reckless incompetent, cushioned by wealth and privilege. Bit harsh, maybe." "Point is," said Nigel, "that you're wrong. The Cameron years will come to be looked back on as a halcyon era. I truly believe that." "You do?" "He was a radical, a moderniser, a man of vision, a man of great personal and moral courage." "Was it courageous of him to resign the day after the referendum and leave other people to clear up the mess he'd made? That showed him to be a man of principle, a man who keeps his promises. But he promised not to resign if he lost the vote, and a man who's prepared to change his mind when the circumstances require it." Nigel was speaking with great passion. Doug felt suddenly sorry for him. "Are the 2 of you still in touch?" "I don't like to impose," said Nigel. "I don't feel I should disturb him. Dave has become a very different person since resigning. Very humble, contemplative. He realised that it was time for him to take some big decisions in his life." "Such as?" "Well, buying a shed, for instance." "Ah, yes, I read about the shed. That's where he's writing his memoirs. Buying that shed was such an important step for him. You wouldn't believe how much he's been changed by that shed." Well, I'm not surprised. I read in the paper that it cost £25,000. I hope it's a nice shed. You, Douglas, of all people, should know that very few of the stories printed in British newspapers have any truth in them. As someone who's been feeding stories to the papers for years, I do know what I'm talking about. In the past, Doug thought, Nigel used to say these things as if totally unaware of how self-incriminating they sounded. Now he spoke in the tone of someone merely giving voice to a melancholy truth. Perhaps more revelations could be prized out of him while he was in confessional mode. This was the first time they'd met since Theresa May had become Prime Minister, in the chaotic wake of the referendum. Few journalists had been able to fathom her in that time. Few people had been able to understand how someone so supportive of Britain's EU membership could have performed such a smooth U-turn and assumed the task of steering the country towards Brexit. Could this be a chance to approach the heart of that mystery? Doug leaned forward. So come on, Nigel, one last favour. Tell me what it's like. Tell me what it's really like. Nigel gave him a questioning glance. What it's like? Working for Theresa. What's she like? She's such an enigma. None of us can work out what she really wants or really thinks or really believes. Nigel's manner changed abruptly in the face of this question. At once he reverted to his old, guarded and mysterious self. Theresa is very different to Dave, he said. Yes? I would say she was a woman of many contradictions. Such as? Well, she's very ambitious, but rather cautious. She knows her own mind, but relies heavily on her advisers. She believes in strong leadership, but also in following the will of the people. Ah, the will of the people. I wondered how long it would be before that phrase popped up. You hear it a lot at Party HQ these days. A lot. He was starting to look depressed again. Doug took the opportunity to ask, how's morale then, generally speaking? Oh, morale is absolutely tip-top, said Nigel, swallowing hard. It's a fascinating moment, obviously. Britain is at a turning point, and we're at the very epicenter of the maelstrom, which is transfiguring the political reality of what is obviously a very seismic development in which the tectonic plates of our national history are shifting in a way which is transformational, and being a witness to this. Suddenly he stopped talking. A blankness came into his eyes. His shoulders slumped. He stared down at the foamy surface of his coffee for a minute or more. Finally, he looked up again, and the next words he spoke were the most heartfelt words Doug had ever heard from his lips. We're fucked. Excuse me? We're utterly and irredeemably fucked. It's all chaos. Everyone's running around like headless chickens. Nobody has the faintest idea what they're doing. We're so fucked. Doug quickly whipped out his phone and started recording a voice memo. Is this on the record? He said. Who cares? We're fucked, so what does it matter? What sort of chaos? Who's running around like a headless chicken? Every sort, everyone. Nobody was expecting this. Nobody was ready for it. Nobody knows what Brexit is. Nobody knows how you do it. A year and a half ago, they were all calling it Brexit. Nobody knows what Brexit means. I thought Brexit means Brexit. Very funny. Doug took a Kleenex out of his pocket and passed it to Nigel, who dabbed his eyes with it for a few seconds. His hands were trembling as he did so. Well, anyway, I can see why you want to get away from all that, he said. I'm sure you'll find the perfect niche somewhere. PR, advertising maybe, marketing, media training, something like that. A rather disturbing change started to come over Nigel's face. His eyes began to shine again, this time with amusement, if anything. Doug imagined that he could see the hint of a smile hovering around his lips, too. What's wrong, he said. Those are pretty good suggestions, aren't they? Nigel shook his head slowly. I've got a much better one. Doug said, would you like to tell me about it? Nigel looked from left to right, then over his shoulder, then leaned very close to Doug's face. I'm going to travel around the world. And just as Doug was on the point of nodding and saying, that sounds good, he added with a note of inexpressible triumph, in a hot air balloon. Seeing that he'd reduced his companion to open-mouthed silence, Nigel rose to his feet and started declaiming, first to Doug himself and then to the bemused patrons of the cafe as a whole. Yes, that's life for me, cresting the superb peaks of the French Pyrenees, following the course of the Ganges as it rolls majestically towards the Bay of Bengal. He began wriggling into his coat with some difficulty, struggling to force his arms into the turned-out sleeves. No more lying to the newspapers, no more spouting out the rubbish that politicians are too embarrassed to say themselves. I'm free, I tell you, free to soar like a bird through the open skies. As the other customers looked on with increasing alarm, Nigel flung open the door of the cafe and strode out into the fresh air. Doug tried to wave after him, but Nigel no longer seemed to be looking. Doug's last glimpse of his long-time trusted source was of a flapping, agitated figure striding off into the distance. his arms still trapped across his chest as he wrestled with the sleeves of his recalcitrant coat. For some reason, who knows why, it made him think of a straitjacket.
Thank you. In one of their earlier conversations, Doug looks at Nigel and you write, he couldn't tell whether Nigel was joking or not. It was to become an increasingly familiar feeling over the next few years. And that really struck me as sort of, it was really capturing the sort of the decline in seriousness with which politics was treated, with which politics was practiced. It also called to mind that I believe, not perhaps apocryphal quote from Wellington about like the Battle of Waterloo being won on the playing fields of Eton. And that sort of sense of like sort of the entirety of British politics being reduced to a game between a certain group of well-heeled people.
Yeah, I suppose it is a comic novel about the collapse of seriousness in British politics, really, which is a weird kind of paradox. Another reason I wanted to start the book in 2010 was that this was when the coalition government was formed. Britain's first coalition government, was it? I think between the Conservatives and the Liberals, and this was a very strange moment because these were two parties who were diametrically opposed in many of their policies, and Britain doesn't really do coalitions. I mean, other European countries do, but it's a very alien concept to us. And a lot of people were very sceptical about how or whether this coalition could work, but that was sort of brushed under the carpet, and there was this extraordinary press conference which the two leaders, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, gave in the Rose Garden behind number 10 Downing Street. And they just sort of larked about for the cameras, really. And I remember reading an article by a journalist, I don't remember who, because a lot of people were expressing surprise at this, that two people who'd been on the opposite side of the political divide were suddenly being so matey with each other. And this journalist said, well, if you've been to one of these public schools, you would know that this is how it works, that all these people kind of know each other and share basically the same values. And, they've known each other since they were teenagers probably, and it's all very cozy. And, when Doug says to Nigel in their very first discussion, how can a partnership between David Cameron and Nick Clegg work when they're so different? And Nigel kind of looks at him and says, what do you mean? And he says, oh, you mean one of them went to Eton and the other one went to Westminster? And he said, yeah, that is quite a big difference. I see your point now, but we think we can make it work. And I suppose what Brexit has made people realise, some people anyway, is that this kind of cult of the British upper class gentleman amateur who can turn his hand, it's usually a he, to almost anything. And Boris Johnson is the other obvious epitome of this kind of thing. That's kind of met its comeuppance in the last few years because we thought, as far as I can see, that we could just kind of breeze into the negotiations with the EU and say, oh, come on, chaps, we're British. Cut us a special deal. We're different. Everybody loves us. And they haven't played ball, funnily enough. They've actually required us to conduct quite serious negotiations, which has been a bit of a shock, I think, to a lot of the politicians involved. And, kind of amateurism and unseriousness, which have always been two things that Britain's kind of prided itself on, has had its day, I think.
Another sort of approach concerning seriousness. I mean, this is in many ways a very serious novel, and clearly you feel very, very deeply and very seriously about the political situation in Britain. I mean, your work from the very beginning has been engaged with political issues, whether they be sort of economic or concerning the rise of the far right and things like that. And yet you're able to write a comic novel about them. And I'm just intrigued to hear a little bit about that sort of how that is for a novelist who clearly feels these things very deeply and very personally and takes them very seriously, to then be able to highlight the absurdity and to turn it into something which is informative but is also entertaining?
Well, comedy and seriousness coexist in literature and in life, I think, and I kind of feel you're missing out on half of human experience if you don't do justice to them both somehow or other. And one way in which Middle England differs from most of my books, including some of the recent ones, is that there isn't actually a plot in this book. There is a political narrative which I took from real events and which starts in April 2010 and comes up till September 2018. But what's going on the micro level between the characters is actually quite shapeless, and it's just people falling in and out of love and having trouble with their careers and having trouble with their elderly parents and just the day-to-day things that preoccupy most of us. And that kind of life, that kind of daily unspectacular life is full of comedy, I think. And because I was determined this time to let that breathe and not to force the characters into a kind of diagram as I have done in some of my other books, kind of to my surprise, the book became quite funny. I mean, I didn't think when I started it whether it was going to be a comic novel or a solemn novel or anything like that. I just wanted to see where the characters took me. And one of the reasons this has been one of my most enjoyable books to write is that it kept surprising me, and scenes which I thought were going to be very serious turned out to be funny, and scenes which I thought were going to be very comic turned out to be quite dark. And there's a lot of different tonal shades, but that's just how life is, isn't it?
And did it highlight to you the kind of the absurdity of everything that was going on, the fact that a comic scene would sort of arise unbidden out of something, out of like quite a serious topic? It seems to sort of just to highlight that absurdity.
Well, the comedy among the ordinary characters, for want of a better phrase, the families who people the novel is quite warm and quite gentle in some ways and life affirming, and the comedy to do with Nigel and Doug and the other politician, the real politicians who are mentioned in the book, has quite an edge to it, I think. So there are two different kinds of humour at work in the book, actually. A kind of warm, inclusive humour and a more cutting, satirical humour.
Now, I'm going to, in a moment, open up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question for Jonathan, get it ready. But I'd just like to finish, because we've talked a lot about about the nation and ideas of the self. And one of the most striking chapters in the book is around the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. And I think one of the reasons that does stand apart, particularly for me as I was reading it, was that it gives almost another spin on patriotism, in as much as this ceremony, whether it was a facade or whatever, seemed to celebrate, to sort of present a friendly British patriotism, which, at least in my lifetime, I'd never come across before. It wasn't embarrassed or ashamed, but neither was it sort of flag waving and bombastic. It just seemed perfectly pitched. And I was just wondering if you could just reflect particularly on the significance of this to the narrative arc, I guess, of Middle England.
Quickly going back to satire. Satire is useless, by the way, and this book confirms my feeling about that, because among other things, it's a commentary on the austerity policies of the Cameron government and how they led to discontent fueling Brexit, and the person responsible for those was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, and he chose it as Book of the Year in the Evening Standard last year. So the joke obviously didn't get through to him. As for the Olympic opening ceremony, I mean, exactly like Sophie in the book, 6 years ago, whenever it was, 6 years ago, I sat down that evening, very hot evening in July, thinking in a kind of slightly kind of resigned, cynical way. Well, I suppose I better watch this, and expecting it to be people marching around a stadium with military music playing in the background and that kind of thing. And I just thought that what Danny Boyle and Frank Cottrell Boyce, who authored the ceremony, achieved was a very smart and very ironic, but very celebratory vision of Englishness, one which did full justice to the quirkiness and eccentricity which we like to pride ourselves on, but also, celebrated industrial achievements and technological achievements, celebrated our popular culture. It was very inclusive. It presented a very open face to the world. I think the lesbian kiss in our soap opera Brookside was that was the first time two women kissing had been shown on British TV, and they beamed that thing out to every country in the world, including Saudi Arabia and places like that. It was a very bold statement of our values, actually, and some people didn't like it because they thought it was too politically correct, but most of us really did, and we felt very proud to be British that night, I think. And that chapter ends part one of the book. Part two of the book ends with a completely different day in June 2016, when Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, unveiled his famous, what is now known as the Breaking Point poster, which was a kind of racist poster designed to scare people into thinking that staying in the EU would mean we would be overrun with migrants. And that afternoon, after he'd unveiled that poster, Joe Cox, the Labour MP, was murdered by a far-right terrorist. And really, I suppose the whole question I wanted to ask in that book was, how did we get from the Olympic evening to that afternoon in 4 short years? It seemed quite a fall, really.
Yeah. Over to you. If you have a question for Jonathan Coe, raise your hand. We'll get the microphone to you so everyone can hear you. Over there. Okay, we'll come around this way.
Thank you, Mr. Coe. I haven't read Middle England, but from this evening it seems that your story involves almost completely the middle class characters. I have 2 short questions, if I may. Does your story also include the ones that are probably affected most, a voice from the working class? And secondly, can you cheer us up a bit by telling us that you can see some signs or somebody that we can feel a bit optimistic about? Thank you.
Wow, that's a tricky one. For a lot of this may feel hard to believe, but for a lot of British people in the last couple of years, the only thing that's been giving them optimism is Macron. And Macron. Yes, and people have been looking at him and saying, yeah, at least in France, the centre left is still working well for the country and this kind of thing. So that particular British take on French politics has taken a bit of a knock in the last few days, I have to say, probably rightly. To answer your first question, yes, there are characters from the post-industrial northeast of England in the book. There is an old school friend of Benjamin who I guess is from the working class. I mean, the middle class is what I know best and what I write about best, I think. But obviously, one of the strands leading to the Brexit vote was this idea of the left behind. The people whose towns and communities and livelihoods were decimated by Thatcherism in the 1980s and have never really been put back together again. So there are gestures towards that in the book, although it's not kind of the main theme. Optimism. I'll come back to you on that one.
Will Jacob Rees-Mogg's name come up much in the future, do you think?
Jacob Rees-Mogg. I thought we were talking about optimism. I don't know. His rise has been so weird. I mean, he's just a backbencher. It's just a backbencher with no real. He doesn't even have the kind of weird, ironic, popular appeal of Boris Johnson. I don't think. I don't know. Well, my optimistic prediction, which will probably turn out to be wrong, as most of my predictions are, is that if either Theresa May's deal gets through Parliament and we leave the EU on that basis, or if we end up remaining in the European Union as a result of a second referendum, which is a distant possibility, I think, then Rees-Mogg will retreat into the shadows and we won't hear much from him again. Possibly. Is he a possible future Prime Minister? Only in a dystopian future, I think. I really don't see... I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about the decline of seriousness in British politics, really. It's plus the fact that for various reasons, I mean, the Joe Cox murder being the most extreme example, it's not a very attractive proposition to go into politics these days. I mean, I've also been hearing about French MPs who have been getting death threats this week and having their houses put under guard and so on. So, I don't really see what the incentive is for charismatic, idealistic people to go into politics at the moment. And you could argue that it's not even where real power lies with the political class. So in Britain, Caroline Lucas would be my choice for a future Prime Minister, the Green leader. Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Yeah, gentleman over there.
Thanks a lot for being here. And I saw this comment a while ago, which said that Brexit was the last middle finger of baby boomers to the millennials. And I was thinking that maybe it's not only a political issue; it's very much a cultural issue as well.
Yes, I think so. Mainly a cultural issue.
Yeah, because today politics, you cannot just divide it in left and right. And I think everyone is in a way nostalgic for a middle ground, for a center. And I was wondering, I mean, you can just, what's your, maybe, I don't know, it's not an easy question, I guess, but do you have some sort of utopia for what's happening today if we don't consider the obstacles? Like what could work? But maybe it could work on paper, but not necessarily in practice.
Well, really, it's in answer to a question like that, it's easier for me to say read the book rather than to come out with a quick answer, because the generational divide, the divide between university educated and non-university educated people, the divide between the rural areas and the towns, these are all the divides which are explored in the book and which are not peculiar to Britain or England at all. I mean, these are the same divides which are fracturing countries across Europe, I think. I don't know. I mean, I have found myself developing a kind of ageism recently, which I kind of want to guard against, because I think it's something like 75 or 80% of over 65s. Not just voted for Brexit, but poll highly in all sorts of views to do with an authoritarian mindset, wanting to bring back the death penalty, wanting to reduce immigration, and so on. And whatever you say about millennials, I do have a certain hope in their ability to, once the rest of us have kind of shuffled off the stage, to sort things out a bit. One of the many ironies of Brexit, which I don't write about in the book, is this notion which pollsters have come up with recently of crossover day. I don't know if anybody has heard about this. It's January the 19th next year. And even if nobody whatsoever changes their mind about how they voted in the 2016 referendum, by sheer virtue of demographics. Enough older people will have died, sadly, and enough younger people will have come of voting age that on January the 19th next year we will become a Remain supporting country, just 2 months before we leave the European Union. So the majority for this policy won't even exist when we carry it out. This is why I find it easier to talk in terms of irony than optimism, I think.
We're going to have to knock it on the head in a moment. I just wanted to refer back to one thing at the very beginning of The Closed Circle. One of the characters reflects that you can take the temperature of a nation from the way it drives its cars. And I was just wondering, how are things on the roads in the UK at the moment?
Yeah, they're pretty intense, actually. Yes. I mean, yes, driving is a very important theme in Middle England as well. Do you have this thing in France where if you're caught speeding, you can go on a course to make you a better driver?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been on 3 of these courses. You can only go once every 3 years, and I've been on 3 in the last 9 years now. And in fact, a key scene at the beginning of the novel takes place on one of these courses. So yeah, I mean, when you're driving in Britain, you really realise what a tight, crowded little country it is. Actually, I think we're rather polite drivers, considering how cheek by jowl we are with each other. But yeah, I stand by that statement in The Closed Circle. Always watch how a nation drives.
On which note, that is all we've got time for. Earlier, Jonathan said rather than answer the question, I should just say buy the book, read the book. And that I can't really echo that advice more. I mean, it really is an exceptional novel. It does, I guess it deals with politics in a way that perhaps uniquely the novel can, in giving a multiplicity of voices, a multiplicity of viewpoints. It gives us sort of an empathy for different viewpoints, and potentially a way we might overcome our differences, which is, I think, much harder to convey in a work of non-fiction, and which a novel is uniquely suited for. And Middle England is a wonderful example of that. Of course, we have, as usual, plenty of copies of Middle England available at the front, as well as copies of the Rotters Club and The Closed Circle, and I think more or less all of Jonathan's backlist. So do pass by there. Jonathan will be here signing copies of the book. Stick around for a glass of wine. Continue the conversation with each other, with Jonathan. And please join me one more time in thanking Jonathan Coe.
Thank you very much. Thank you.